Lead me, oh Lord, won't you lead me? I'm tired.
Hello, my name is Father Timothy Tighe, and this is our 10th overview in our journey of faith in the light of the cross, and I thank you so much for joining us. We look up on our screen and we see the theme for this 10th overview. God inspired the P editors to see the journey to Sinai in 3 dimensions. First, the original J journey with Moses. Second, the journey of the first exiles out of Jerusalem to Babylon, which they considered Sinai. And third, the journey of the second exiles. We go on to our next screen and we read, the original first dimension story of Exodus out of Egypt was written by the J or Yahwist, we can use either letter, writers. The J or Y wrote in the time of Solomon about 950 BC. But the actual Exodus happened about 1300 BC, 350 years before. The P or priestly editors, the second dimension of our story, our theme, felt inspired by God to add their insights to J around 580. The priestly editors felt inspired because of their Exodus experience out of Jerusalem through the wilderness to Babylon. We go on to our next screen and we read, the Yahwist, the Bible's first theologian, is written by Peter Ellis, so we take all the J writings out and put in one book, so I'm sure I know who wrote this section of the Bible. And we see the word the Yahwist here, the Bible's first theologian. We go on to our next screen and we read, the P writers came to see their journey as an exodus out of the slavery of Jerusalem's sinful ways. They believed their exodus was God's will, for in Babylon they were free to observe the Mosaic law without the terrible distractions of pagan fertility sex in Jerusalem. They were finally free of it. Once again, the P could love their God with their whole heart, mind, and soul. Even more, they easily prospered in Babylon. We go on to our next screen and we read, the exodus to Babylon was over 600 miles, much further to avoid the wilderness. Because Babylon needed their skills and talents, they allowed the first exiles to carry their sacred scrolls in a very reverential tent, which is another word for tabernacle. So the P editors began to identify with their forefathers who carried the Ark of the Covenant through the wilderness to the promised land from Egypt. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. The second dimension P writers wanted to bring more order and clarity to J's original story. So P added 12 stopping places on the journey from Egypt to the promised land. 6 from Egypt to Sinai and 6 from Sinai to Israel. This gave order, which is very important to the P writers, to the journey and made it teachable and easier to visualize and memorize for the students. We go on to our next screen and we read, Babylon was good to the first exiles because the strict observance of the law made them more dependable and talented workers. They were exceptional. Thus, P saw God revealing a more developed Sinai covenant to the exiles. So P began to identify Babylon with Mount Sinai. The more developed law empowered Judeans to grow individually without king or country so they could live any place alone in the world and still be faithful. We go on to our next screen and we read, the J writers received good scrolls, for Joseph and Moses inspired even Israeli slaves to see the importance of the written word in God's plan. So Moses and Joseph were very well educated and they must have handed it down. Thus, priestly editors respected the J's writings. It was very good. and just added their own writing, and this is what we're going to do today. The second dimension, P, respected the writings of J, which we label the first dimension, and J is the second dimension. We go on to our next screen, and we continue reading. J wrote in Exodus 12, 29 to 32, these three verses. At midnight, Yahweh struck down all the firstborn in Egypt. Verse 30, there was not a house in Egypt without someone dead. Pharaoh told Moses, do me a favor, leave and take your people and your flocks with you as you demanded. A key word. The P editors wanted to emphasize why the first exiles did so well in Babylon. Do not be afraid to ask or demand from the oppressor. You are very valuable to our oppressors, and you have God on your side if you observe the Mosaic law. We go on to the next screen. P adds 12:34, the people took their unleavened dough with them. Why is this important? Leaven breaks down wheat in a corruption process like slavery breaks down and corrupts slaves. So leave leaven and corruption behind in Egypt. Thus P in Babylon made sacred till today the 7 days of unleavened bread during Passover. P added this to J in order to emphasize that after Passover, there's 7 days of unleavened bread to symbolize leaving the corruption behind. Observance of Passover and law helped keep Judah free from the breakdown of corruption. We go on to our next screen and we read. P continues, Israel obeyed Moses and asked the Egyptians for silver, gold, and clothes. They were unafraid to do it. The Lord's plagues disposed the Egyptians to give Israel whatever they asked for to get them out of there. So the Israelites despoiled Egypt. Why is this important? The slaves had Yahweh on their side, so they despoiled Egypt as they left. But the exiles who zealously observed the law in Babylon will return to Judah someday, and they will bring the riches of Babylon with them. It did happen that way. Now we go on to our next slide. And we read, what were the priests trying to teach? The first exiles had education and high-level skills that Babylon needed. Their elite standing gave them the confidence to demand respect. Since they had surrendered, Babylon allowed them to take wealth and whatever they considered important for them. A Judean is a better worker and more valuable when he heroically observes the law. Now this happened in the past, but the P writers wanted the next generation to learn this lesson. Do not be afraid to ask or even demand your value. We go on to our next screen and we read. The third dimension began when the second exiles entered Babylon half naked, beaten, shamed, and humiliated. The first exiles felt it was the worst humiliation Judah ever endured, and they felt partially responsible. All Judeans at that time felt a deep need to establish an annual observance of repentance to prevent the shame and humiliation of the second exiles from ever happening again. This led to the observance of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. How did this happen? We go to our next page. P saw J's story of the golden calf in Exodus 32, verses 1 to 29, as a way to connect Yom Kippur to Sinai. P adds 32, 7 to 10. Hearing pagan fertility hymns on Sinai, Yahweh and Moses overflowed with wrath. Exodus 32, 11. This is the J writer. But Moses then implored Yahweh to quench his wrath. Yahweh somewhat relents. Verse 21. As Moses descends, he smashes the 2 tablets. Then in verse 26, he gathers the Levites and commands them to kill the guilty. The Levites are consecrated to God's service forever for killing 3,000. Now we go on to our next page. The J writers, the original writers, the first dimension, wrote in Exodus 32:25, Moses saw that Aaron had let the people run wild. Others translate run wild as run loose. It means they loosened their girdles or belts to uncover themselves for pagan fertility cults. Now P takes this and adds 32:30-34. Moses said to the survivors, you have committed a grave sin, but I will go back up to the Lord. Perhaps I will be able to make atonement, which means forgiveness, which means Yom Kippur. So P used J to begin Yom Kippur observance. We go on to our next screen. 32:32. Moses said to the Lord, if only you would forgive their sins. If not, then strike me out of the book that you have written. Verse 33 of the P writers. The Lord answered, only him who has sinned against me will I strike out of my book. So P set the atmosphere for the beginning of the annual observance of Yom Kippur. Now I want you to please go back to fathertighe.com and review chapter 32, but especially segments 190 and 191. We go on to our next page and we read, the reading on the last day of Yom Kippur is Leviticus 18, which repeats over 18 times the sin of uncovering another's nakedness. The humiliation of the second exiles was that they were uncovered for sex with soldiers or with each other, and it was joined to those uncovered before the golden calf. So the two incidents are brought together. All Judeans are warned never to uncover any nakedness that will shame Judah as second exiles and those who dance before the golden calf. P's reading is still effective on Yom Kippur, so it's read even today and it's still effective. We go on to our next page and we read, the Torah books journey up to Sinai and Covenant, then P inserts the whole book of Leviticus. Now we did this in the past. We begin with Genesis and we climb to Mount Sinai in the middle of the desert in Exodus. Then we go to chapter 25. And then we continue through 25 to the end of Exodus, which we have been doing tonight, chapter 32 we just covered. And then it's very important, they insert the whole book of Leviticus, which is here, and they insert the first 10 chapters of Numbers. So all of this happens in this plateau near Sinai. And then they continue on to finish Numbers and go to Deuteronomy. So we want you always to remember how the Torah was put together. We go on to our next screen and we read, God inspired the P editors to see the journey to Sinai in 3 dimensions. First, the original J journey with Moses. Second, the journey of the first exiles out of Jerusalem to Babylon, Sinai. And third, the journey of the second exiles. And all of this is put together by the P priestly writers. Thank you so much for joining us for this journey of faith in the light of the cross.
Lead me, oh Lord, won't you lead me? Lead me, guide me along